everybody, and welcome to On the Hook, the official Yellow Pike Media podcast. My name is Rick. I'll be your host. I'm joined by two guests today who I will let introduce themselves. Brian is actually a member of the team here. Brian, why don't you start off, and then you can intro our guest.
All right. Brian Lerner. I am a creative director and executive producer here at Yellow Pike, and Rick and I have been working together for a lot of years now. And our guest is a very old, close friend of mine, in full transparency, Noam Dromi. He's the man. Wait, I'm sorry.
You're saying I'm old, or what?
Well, I'm the old one. I am older.
That is true.
And Noam is the managing director of Reboot Studios. And if you wouldn't mind, I would love to hear a little bit about Reboot and what you're doing over there first.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, really appreciate the opportunity to be here talking to you both today. Reboot Studios is a arts and culture nonprofit that was originally started over 20 years ago and funded by Steven Spielberg's endowment and philanthropy called the Righteous Persons Foundation, and also the foundation for the Bronfman family that owns Seagram's, that used to own Universal, and are a Canadian-American family of great renown in the philanthropy and nonprofit space. And I think our mandate over the last year, we've really transitioned into creating a for-profit content studio that really is attempting to elevate the narratives of people in the broader Jewish community. That means that I think at a time of rising anti-Semitism, and I even just read a quote in the Washington Post today that said, since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, anti-Semitic posts have risen something like 400% or something insane of that nature. Just that you allow people from that broad community to be able to share their own stories and create a platform and resources that support them in doing so. And as for me, more broadly, I've been in the media and entertainment and technology space for 30 years now, almost. Because I started working on movie sets when I was 16, so about 30 years ago, and have run the gamut from working in the digital and interactive space. I'm one of the recipients of the very first Primetime Emmy for narrative content created in virtual reality for a project that I produced called the Sleepy Hollow Virtual Reality Experience. I've been in the gaming space, in the movie space, the TV space, the live event space. So I have always been a big believer, and I think it's so apropos to our discussion today that it very much, it's not the medium, it's the message. And I'm just focused on finding great platforms by which to tell interesting stories.
Awesome. That's quite the resume, and a very great cause, by the way. And I've also read that statistic recently about Twitter. It's not a path we want to go down right now, but it is definitely troublesome and worrisome, and we should all be very much aware of that.
Yeah, and that's true, by the way, in any set of groups. When you think about people who have historically been marginalized, disenfranchised, scapegoated, I think you've got to speak with a strong voice. This is not the time to shy away from controversy or allow other people to run roughshod. I'm a huge believer in free speech, but at the same time, I think we always have to assert that people have a right to, safety and liberty and well-being. And I hope to always be a proponent of telling those kinds of stories and supporting those kinds of people.
Couldn't agree more. I believe there's also an attendant responsibility of speech within that conversation too.
Well
so,
stated.
thank you. Thank you, Noam. So let's talk about IPs and this great concept that I've recently learned the name of called transmedia. The idea of an IP existing in multiple places, all at the same time, telling either versions of or a extension of a single story. And I think where we should start off probably is with the big buzz right now, The Last of Us, the HBO show, without dropping spoilers, of course. I think it's a really great example of how transmedia works well, in that it's taken something that's highly interactive, highly user-focused, and pulled the story out and made it this vast tapestry that maybe got lost in the original game version, but now has this great new media it can live in and grow and evolve. What are your thoughts on the success of Last of Us, and why is it so successful?
Sure. And it's interesting. A quick detour by way of answering your question. I think another example, somewhat in reverse of this phenomenon that we're speaking about, is Hogwarts Legacy. When you recognize that, I think that the way in which people today engage with stories and the access to so many media touch points that we have is that in some respects, one entry point is not even sufficient any longer. So I think that we're seeing a maturation and sophistication of media in gaming, in traditional media, in streaming, and that people, when they become engaged with story worlds and IP, are really actively seeking out new formats and new platforms by which to get further aspects of the story. Because the truth of the matter is, no one medium can necessarily cater to the nuances, the depth, or the interest in a particular thread of a storyline that others can. So I think with Last of Us, which I think was such a seminal work, and Craig Mazin's work on it, after coming off of Chernobyl, is that you don't necessarily think that video games are going to tell the level of depth in terms of extending their stories into film and television that this did. I think, for among other things, one of the great examples of that was really the storyline in episode 3, the Frank and Bill side of the story. Because if you're a fan of the game, and by the way, let me take a moment and step back and go that, in my opinion, Last of Us is one of the greatest video games in the modern era of gaming. I'm obsessed with it. It was something that I played for hours and hours on end, and was so excited by the knowledge that such a formidable team was going to be working on the television adaptation of the story. But really, to come back to the crux of your question, I think what worked so effectively is that they were able to drill down and tell character stories and have this level of character development that the game was never meant to do. So you had this episode 3, which stands out as just, in my opinion, one of the strongest episodes of the show. It did something because it told a 20-year backstory of two characters who were obviously in the game, but whose story was nowhere near as detailed and evolved. All of this by way of saying that I think that what we're finding is, when people who are doing adaptations are really taking the time to understand the themes, the character moments, and the deeper connection to what these stories are about, they're going to make much more interesting stuff than if they're just trying to do a surface kind of get rich quick scheme adaptation of something.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And I'm so glad you mentioned episode 3, because that's kind of my personal example to people who don't understand either space well, that, this is something that everybody knew from the game, but absolutely did not know from the game at the same time, right? No one had any idea of this amazing backstory. Do you think that there's something inherent in, say, episodic storytelling like The Last of Us that makes it easier to adapt than a single sort of event like a feature film? Would maybe The Last of Us not have been so impressive if it were a single 2 or 3 hour major feature, as it has been in the episodic form?
So I think you're asking a great question. I'm going to give you sort of a two-pronged answer. I think obviously the secret sauce in any instance of an adaptation fundamentally comes down to who's the creative team that's adapting it and what is their take on it. Now, I think to your point, what we are discovering is that something like Last of Us, which was episodic in nature of how the story was told when it was a game at first, lends itself to something that's a little bit more evolved and detailed than a 2 or 3 hour film. But I think more and more we're seeing this truism in both film and television, that we're looking for bigger franchises, bigger worlds. So truthfully, I don't know that Last of Us would have ever only been a movie anyway, as opposed to like a series of films, not dissimilar from what they did with and Harry Potter's not an example, but what they did with what was the Jennifer Lawrence film series that I'm totally blanking on right now?
Oh, the Hunger Games.
So I'm saying we're more and more seeing, so Hunger Games being an example as well, we're more and more seeing that things that look like they would fit into one story become multiple stories. The Hobbit did this as well. So I think that right now, television creatively is going through a renaissance that frankly the film business is just not keeping up with because the incentives and the economics are different. I agree with what I believe is your fundamental premise, which is that I don't necessarily think Last of Us would have been as effective even if it were a series of films and what it was able to accomplish. And even, by the way, a very morally conflicted ending when you really had to stop when he saved Ellie and you had to stop and think about he lied to her in terms of what really happened. Like, did he do the right thing? Did he not? Those kinds of things, the water cooler talk around TV and the immediacy of weekly installments, that was only made this experience of this adaptation stronger, in my opinion.
Do you feel that it used to be streaming services like HBO Plus, where here's all of our content, boom, on one day, and you binge it and you're done and you walk away?
I hate that. I hate that. And I'm very much against it. I think the three of us are of an age where we grew up where there was a reason to talk about something every week. The problem is when you drop it all at once, in the water cooler talk only lasts for a brief period of time and then no one remembers it a month later. I don't think that's the way to tell stories. Just my
You think the weekly episodic approach is superior and probably honestly helped Last of Us become what it became culturally?
I agree with you 1,000%. And look, there are different experiments in kind of the distribution of this kind of content. You're seeing people drop, 2 or 3 episodes at the start of a season, and then they'll do, weekly installments subsequently. There's no clear answer to it other than that I think the phenomenon we saw from 2015 to 2020 of drop the whole season at once, I just think it's a mistake, and a lot of great content gets lost in the white noise of so much stuff coming out week after week after week.
Sure, you end up consuming it over the weekend, right, Brian? I mean, and then you're done.
Sorry, yeah. Well, I was also going to say that I think we have so much choice in the world today, and this was one other example of like too much of companies thinking that they're giving the audience what they want by dumping it all at once. And I think there was like a real understanding that no, we actually as humans like that anticipation. We like some scheduled entertainment time like regular live TV. And there will always be people that are going to begrudge it and complain and want to be able to binge it in a weekend, like you said, Rick. But I think inherently we do really like that. And we do like having that being able to have a conversation around these things. It's like, it's just part of our humanity and part of our life experience that a lot of us are missing and want back.
Well, and Brian, I want to take a moment to really emphasize the point that you made, which is, before streaming was a thing, the mantra at HBO was it's not TV, it's HBO. But one of the things they did effectively and really is a crown that they have maintained for 2 decades is they own the Sunday night dramatic television space. Like no one is really doing what they did. And that was true of Sex and the City and The Sopranos. That was true of The Wire. That was true of all of their shows that become appointment television on Sunday nights. In the 80s and 90s, NBC did that for Thursdays. I think ABC had the Thursday slot and the Wednesday slot as well. But HBO has managed to maintain that, and they continue that legacy with House of Dragons. They continue that legacy with Last of Us, and now with Succession's final season coming up as well.
I would agree wholeheartedly. I mean, yeah, like you mentioned, NBC had what did they call it? The must-see TV, exactly. And HBO has really, without having to say it, made Sunday nights must-see HBO, right? Yeah. There are competitors out there now, but I do find, at least for myself, that when it comes to here's the 4 shows that drop on Sundays, this one is the one I watch on Sundays, and it's almost always the HBO show because I know I can get the others on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
But let's talk about another important point that you raised in terms of that brand mantle that they've created and why Last of Us fits so organically into that. I don't know about you guys. Another big game adaptation, which I've been looking forward to for 20 years, was Halo. I think Paramount Plus shit the bed on that because I didn't think it was a good show. I didn't know when to watch it, and it wasn't something that I felt motivated to tune into every single week. I was like, I'll just wait and then I'll watch it at the end of a season, because they didn't have that same level of brand loyalty. And I think what they thought they were trying to do with the adaptation of that game may have seemed like it made more sense in the planning than it ultimately did in the execution.
I find Halo to be an interesting example of how gamers really rejected the IP, the series, because everywhere I was looking and hearing, I was hearing this isn't Halo. It's an okay show, but it's not Halo, right? Meanwhile, my wife, on the other hand, thinks it's a great show, but she has zero point of reference in the Halo universe, which I thought was the really interesting. It's appointment watch for her. She will, when it drops, watch.
Interesting. And look, I think that becomes part of the broader points of the discussion we're having today, which is when you're adapting books, when you're adapting magazine articles, when you're adapting games, which is how do you speak to the core, appeal to the masses, and also realize that if you're adapting a game in some respects, it's how do you pull on threads that the game that stay true to the spirit and the gravitas of the game, but the game never fully explored. Last of Us, I think, did that beautifully. But even think about like Resident Evil. Ultimately, that was a hugely successful franchise. Most of those individual films had nothing to do with the Resident Evil game. So the question becomes, look, with so many distribution outlets, I think there is a clear opportunity to do a lot of different and interesting things in adaptations. One of the things I'm incredibly looking forward to on Apple TV is the Tetris movie. Now, the Tetris movie is about the making of Tetris, but it's like a Cold War espionage thriller, yet it still is tied to game IP in a way. And it's that level of creative ingenuity that I think is the lifeblood of what we have to look forward to, as opposed to awful shit that came in the past, whether it was, the Bob Hoskins, John Leguizamo, Super Mario Brothers, or frankly, even the new one that's coming out with the voice of Chris, what's his name?
Chris Pratt, yeah.
Chris Pratt. Look, I still think, and I know Brian can say this as a writer and producer as well, I'm sure you can too, which is it all just comes down to what's the story you're trying to tell and why does anyone care?
Exactly.
Well, also, isn't some of the biggest challenge of this is like having to care about the existing game audience and wanting them to watch the television or feature adaptation, but also knowing that for that to be successful, you need to make it broader. You need to bring in a new audience that doesn't really know the game. So I'm a good example of someone who didn't play. Why am I blanking on?
Last of Us.
Last of Us. Oh my God. And I loved it. I watched it. But so I didn't have anything. I didn't have skin in the game. I didn't have anything anchored in my love of this previous version of this storytelling, but that seems to be the biggest challenge and where a lot of it falls short. Halo being a good example. I'm sure, people bring baggage into these things that are so passionate about these games. So I just wanted to bring up the topic of like what the challenge of that and how do you balance it? And like, at what point should these film and TV makers care? Do you have to just abandon that audience at some point to make something great? And, is The Last of Us a great example of balance, or is it just a great television series that everyone ended up loving?
I sort of think it's a little bit of both. And look, the devil will be in the details of like whether or not it's an outlier or not. You just happen to have premium creators of the highest level who knew the game, who understood also, look, the game, perhaps different than other examples and iterations of game adaptations, is so driven by a strong central storyline and a real depth of character development in its own right, which was a great jumping off point for the exploration of something a bit more deeply in this television episodic sort of format. A lot of other times, I don't think that the creators really know the story they're trying to tell. So yes, as you heard me say before, I do believe speak to the core, appeal to the masses sort of works to a point, but this is as true with any other kind of fandom. You cannot be a creator making mass market entertainment where you're more worried about trying to appease the fans than you are about telling a good story. It'll never work.
I agree. And to go the opposite direction from Brian is I am a player. I have played both installments of The Last of Us. And for me, learning that extra depth of the story was huge. It pulled me even further.
To play the game again, frankly.
Exactly. And the other thing is there are moments in that show where I was turning to my wife and saying, that's frame for frame in the game. That is an exact recreation of what happens in the game. Yep. And I think that speaks very well to how do you make that transition appeal to the masses while also drawing in that new audience. You get that amazing storytelling, but there's also those little tidbits that if you don't know, you don't know. You just think it's a good show. But if you do know, it pulls you in a little bit deeper, like those frame for frame kind of moments in the series.
It's the same kind of Easter eggs you're going to get when you're playing in broader based IP, whether it's reboots or adaptations, the whole Star Trek canon and universe. If you're a Picard fan, if you were a Next Generation fan, there's amazing Easter eggs to enjoy, but you can also have never seen that show from the 80s and 90s and still be able to appreciate it on its own merits. And look, I think it's consistent with what we're all saying. And as I said, I've got 10 years of film studio marketing, digital marketing background. And the truth of the matter is when you lean too heavily to either overly appease the original fans of an IP or to completely ignore them, you're going to lose in both scenarios. And I wish there was a secret sauce to it. It's that perfect alchemy. It's that Rosetta Stone of the right creators, the right time in the marketplace, and the perfect alchemy of a story that resonates with people at the right time. Pedro Pascal was a big part of it. The creators were a big part of it. And frankly, after Walking Dead and that zombie IP being such a part of the discourse for the better part of 10, 12 years, this was a slightly different and more nuanced take on that I think the marketplace was just right for, particularly coming out of a 3-year pandemic.
Right. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, one other thing that they were smart about, which is a way to appease the gaming fan base, is they did use cast members from the game, right, in the series. Which, if you don't think you're leaning heavily enough, maybe to appease that audience, that's a really smart way to do it. Like, you're showing a lot of respect and bringing these people back.
Yeah,
I thought that was really
the original Tess is in it. There's a bunch of people who are in it, and to me and Brian, I agree 100%, because then you're also paying homage and deference without being too obsequious about it, without being too overwrought about it, but yet you're still remembering that it isn't a game. I've worked on biopics, biographical films before, and then the challenge is always, well, we're not telling a documentary here. It's a narrative film, so you gotta make decisions, and the same is true in this kind of adaptation as well. And that's also what's funny when you think about instances where it worked and didn't work. Detective Pikachu worked. I think that Sonic the Hedgehog worked. Now, those are very different kinds of games, but at the same time, when you understand the audience that you're marketing towards and you can have a little bit of homage, but also make something that feels sufficiently different, that to me is where those things kind of work. And has it worked as well as Last of Us? Not quite. And maybe this is ushering new ground for upcoming games.
So give me an example, Last of Us aside, and the games you just mentioned aside, give me an example of an IP where you think they did really well in adapting it and one where they really missed, other than Halo, which we've already talked about.
Well, let's start with one where I think they really missed, which is Assassin's Creed. I don't know what that movie was trying to do, and honestly, it just sort of confused the hell out of me. I think that it didn't really understand why the game IP was as exciting and engaging for its audience as it was, and the story it tried to tell didn't even really work well as a movie. I think Prince of Persia, I would kind of say the same thing in that regard, putting aside the whole cultural thing of casting Jake Gyllenhaal in the role of a Middle Easterner, which I think was just kind of bad form in that regard. What worked? Ghost Recon. No, I had the opportunity in a previous company that I was a part of. Interestingly enough, even though Ubisoft has a film and TV division that's going out to try and sell long form versions of their content to streamers and studios and the like, and they were obviously involved with the recent Michael B. Jordan adaptation that is the precursor to the Rainbow Six series as well. But we had an opportunity to work at the time that this is 2 iterations of Ghost Recon ago, where the version, which was the first open player world, was Wildlands. And we had an opportunity to sort of work with the creators and produce a half-hour scripted pilot called War Within the Cartel that basically told kind of the prequel to the game and got people immersed into the world of the game. It was the first live-action narrative content to premiere on Twitch, and then also premiered on Amazon Prime. And what was exciting about that was that we have data that shows that it drove awareness and engagement and actually helped with sales of the game. And by the way, what I was saying, I was mangling my words before, it was the first open world version of Ghost Recon. So that was just a good example that I sort of particularly responded to in that regard. Now, look, there's a number of different titles. Again, I think Resident Evil worked for what it was. I think there's certainly animated adaptations of games, maybe that might be geared a little bit more towards kids that sort of work in that regard. But it's kind of hit or miss. I don't think anyone necessarily has nailed it perfectly, or as close to as perfectly as something like Last of Us has.
Absolutely. Thank you for reopening my Assassin's Creed wounds. Huge fan of the series. I just don't understand what happened with the film. Do you think sometimes in that kind of transition, maybe studios or producers are looking and seeing, given the Assassin's Creed storyline and where it all fits, do you think there's a desire to not make something which even tangentially looks like something that came before? Because it would be really easy to look at Assassin's Creed done right as a version of the Matrix, right? Because it's kind of similar in the original Animus sort of, virtual reality that you're in, reliving your histories. There's a similarity there. Do you think studios shy away from that? Or are they just missing the point on how it's different and how the fans would react?
So I think you're asking a really smart question. And while I don't necessarily know the producer, I've read some of what Michael Fassbender had to say kind of in the post-mortem of it. I feel like 2 things are at play. One is, and I hate to say it, but you have people adapting video games who hate video games. And that seems very problematic. And also, I think that if they're too, conversely, if they really love video games and they're trying too hard to make it feel exactly like the thing, then they're kind of taking it and themselves a little bit too seriously. And you got to realize that even the way in which stories are experienced by someone playing a game, you have to have certain rudimentary kind of a simplicity and a formula in how stories are told, that they can be very expansive, but you still have mission-oriented objectives and a reason and a purpose to get through the game. And something like Assassin's Creed, the plot was so convoluted and so confusing. It's like, even if you're a fan of the game, it's hard to just keep track of what the hell they're trying to do or say or what is going on. I think, again, you either have people who don't care enough about games or trying to be so didactic and so exacting with it that they're forgetting that they're actually creating for another medium. And then ultimately, they're not really getting the outcome that anyone is going to be excited about, which is a universality of story, so that people who know nothing about the game and don't even care about the game can be engaged, but people who do care about the game have something to align with.
I would agree with that. I definitely felt forced, I guess, is the simplest terms to put it, that they were trying too hard to make it an Assassin's Creed movie instead of a good movie.
Exactly. I agree with that 100%.
Well, so
Let's-
much. I was just going to add, you know, I mean, it's a little bit back to what we were talking about, but so much of this is about trying to be something for everyone. And any creator knows that, like, that's a terrible road to go down. You have to have a point of view. You have to stick to it. The greatest art we've ever had didn't try to appease the masses, in my opinion, at least. So if you are trying too hard to bring all of these groups together around one thing, you really risk it being not very good, or not the best that it could be.
Well, but also realize, again, it can be dependent on genre and a lot of things. So think about the Hitman series. Think about the Max Payne series. Think about Warcraft. Even what was the Tom Holland one that they just did last year? Uncharted. Like, in some instances, you know, if you're telling a big enough of a story in a genre that has a lot of different kind of, you know, entry points to it, I think people make it harder than it needs to be. But I think the point that was raised just a moment ago is, at the end of the day, your number one priority if you're doing an adaptation is make a good film or make a good show. Yes, it has to align with the IP in some way that doesn't feel too fake and too forced. But I think a lot of people are not focused on just telling a good story. And that's so clear in some of these adaptations that simply don't work. And by the way, what's an example of one, again, that did work, such as it was? Tomb Raider. At least the original Tomb Raider, I thought they did a pretty good job of that, and it worked. Others, less so.
I agree. Brian, you mentioned you'd found some upcoming films. Let's talk about things that are in the pipe that are coming, and maybe how we feel about the prospects for these films for a little bit.
Sure. Here, I made a short list. So I think the one that's might be coming out the soonest is Gran Turismo. So a car racing game, which obviously it's not just going to be a movie about cars running around the track. So this is definitely a stretch, right? In my mind, it's like, how do you add a narrative story to just a straight up car racing game?
It's a good question. I mean, Gran Turismo is near and dear to my heart. It's my favorite racing game, so I have to tread lightly here. I feel like Gran Turismo has done a couple of things within the space and within the genre that no other racing games have done. There is actually a Gran Turismo Academy, where if you're good enough at Gran Turismo, through a partnership with Nissan, I think was the most recent one, you can actually find yourself behind the wheel of a fully sponsored race car racing in European circuits. So I would be really curious to know if that's kind of the direction they're going to go, tell the story of some of these racers. I mean, there's a lot of great racing games out there. There's a lot of great racing movies out there. I'm personally having a hard time figuring out where those merge.
Let me say this, though. Gran Turismo is being made by Neil Blomkamp. And the truth of the matter is that when you have someone who's proven themselves in genre at that level, if I'm not mistaken, I think David Harbour from the Stranger Things world and the Marvel Thunderbolts world is going to be in that as well. So when you have a level of creators who are working at that level, I have confidence that these are people by and large who are really going to figure it out. Twisted Metal, they're doing with Anthony Mackie as well. So I, like you, I'm curious. I'm a Gran Turismo fan. It's certainly not a favorite of mine, but I also just feel like there's a certain level of creator who will do things with IP that will be pretty impressive, particularly if they have got the right kind of track record. I don't know how the two of you felt about Spielberg and Ready Player One, but what would that have looked like in the hands of a different director? I don't know. But I think it still comes back to when you've got filmmakers and storytellers who have demonstrated their bona fides in elevated genre, I'm always willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I wonder if the next generation of game creators who have grown up on a diet of games and streaming and film and TV, if there's going to be a movement to create more narrative and cinematic games and build them with the understanding that there can be other mediums in which stories can be more fully explored. I think Warcraft, the film was interesting. There were some book adaptations, but if you start to think about game IP in the context of how can it be built so that the evolution to other formats and platforms just feels very organic, that may actually elevate the whole discourse altogether. If the things continue to exist as silos where there's not a connective tissue with them, I just continue to fear that we'll have some hits and a lot of misses. And it'll be interesting to see what ultimately ends up happening, because I think games, which always are a 4 or 5x multiple in terms of revenue of the movie business writ large, are continuing to get more cinematic and more filmic in how they're made. And hopefully that portends well for how stories translate in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a guarantee, just like anything else. Once there's a proven success going on with these adaptations, every game studio is going to want to infuse those elements to try to bring in a new revenue stream. So if they're seeing these games that have already great stories being adapted and there's success there and another audience and a revenue stream, I think you're going to see a pivot for companies that maybe weren't thinking that way for a long time ahead of us that are going to try their best to do that until that starts to fizzle away. I mean, I think it's not much different than the trends of television and movies where things hit a spike, everyone tries to jump, music too, I should say. It's probably the worst with music, but something hits really big, everyone tries to jump on that bandwagon. It works a little bit for a group of people, and then inevitably, that fades away and the next thing comes along. So I think for sure you're going to see it.
Well, Brian, not only do I agree with that, but I also think, and you and I had interaction when we first met with the prolific studio executive producer and now owner of major sports franchises, Peter Guber, who I ran the digital division of Mandalay Entertainment for a number of years early in my career. And, one of the things he always talked about that really resonates with me to this day is the notion that, storytelling is embedded in the DNA of mankind. That from paintings on cave walls to shamans around the campfire to every iteration of a medium that was a amplifier of stories, the radio, the cathode ray tube, the internet, now AI, and everything else that will come on its heels are different ways in which the human need for storytelling gets evolved, but still fundamentally stays the same. The way I look at it is games are also just an extension of that. Now we have a term in the discourse, gamification, where you're bringing kind of game mechanics to other examples of incentive, reward, and engagement. And that's true in marketing and sales. That's true in extensions of IP and kind of business discourse and everything else. And I think it still comes down to what is the intersection in which great games exceed their reach by way of being more than just that one thing. We've seen great shows and read great books and listened to great music that had a seminal role in a period in history or an intellectual, social, or philosophical movement. Games kind of do that. Maybe there are some examples, and Rick, maybe you can speak to some that resonate for you. But I think we're not even at the tipping point of what that can be, and that is what's exciting to me. And by the way, as someone who's been big in the VR, AR, kind of MR space for the better part of the last decade, I'm also interested to see what those more immersive environments, forget like Pokemon Go, but all these different ways in which the game layer on the real world can have a very transformative effect on building community, changing hearts and minds, and at the end of the day, telling deeper, richer, and more immersive stories.
I think you're spot on. I agree. It's an ever-evolving space, and it's going to be exciting to see where it goes.
And open world stuff is what's so cool, because I almost feel like it is it is like you write the game as you go along in it. And if you think about all this discourse since January of this year about AI and Chat GPT and everything else, the game environment that will let you create it as you're playing it is in our future. And I'm so fascinated to see what that's going to be like. At the end of the day, what I'm finding and I'm excited by as someone who's a creator, but also a marketer and someone who's just a student of the marketplace right now, games are bigger than ever. You've got this narrative that the primary cohort is a certain demographic of young men. For one thing, gamers are trending much older. They're also a growing number of women in that space. There's casual gaming. The kinds of games that they're playing overseas are much different than they're playing here. And that is what's really exciting to me, is that it's not one thing. There's no one way of playing games or telling stories through games. And The Last of Us, to me, represents that perfect sweet spot of the right creators, the right IP, and just a brilliant execution that exceeded expectations. I cannot wait to see what comes next.
We need to have you back on and talk about the 100 million other things that we can talk about in this space, and just really go after it.
20 years of friendship and 23 years of friendship, as Brian can attest to, I've got a lot of opinions about a lot of things, and I'm always happy to come on and chat. Anytime you would like to have me, it would be my privilege.
Yeah. Sometimes they have the right opinions too.
I'm not wading into the middle of that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. We will definitely be in touch. We'll get you back on again. Thank you for being a part of this. I love conversations like this, the crossroads of pop culture, morality, and kind of the future of civilization. It's all summed up in these kind of conversations, why things work, why things don't work. And it's all about humanity in the end. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Look forward to talking again. And everybody have a great day, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, guys.